Let's take a look at racism in South Africa's learning institutions, of course following that incident at Stellenbosch University where a white student was captured on camera urinating on belongings of a black student. One commentator believes that there are not enough race conversations taking place in South Africa. Terry Oakley-Smith, founder of Diversi-T, joins me now to perhaps expand on her views on racism. Terry, very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for coming in studio to speak to us. I mean, the whole conversation around racism always seems to be something we react to when it happens, instead of formulating proper plans to really have that conversation, which is proving very difficult.
I think you're absolutely right, Paul. And I'd like to start off by saying how, as a white person, I feel extremely ashamed and outraged at what happened at Stellenbosch this week. And it shows, you know, what a long way we still have to actually begin to deal with systemic racism in our learning institutions, even in our higher learning institutions. I think it shows us that we haven't worked nearly enough at this if we're still having, frankly, outrageous situations and black students being so discriminated and acted against in such an appalling way.
And what does it speak to? I mean, one doctor that I spoke to was talking about socialization and how, you know, he blames the manner in which Tiens was socialized as a child. So where should we begin as we try and tackle this conversation from grassroots level?
I think it does need to begin. I mean, it should begin with parents. It should begin with children as soon as they're old enough to talk. Talking about race should be a commonplace discussion in all South African homes. And I think that's really important. Too many of us try and say that we don't see race, and that clearly is ludicrous. I mean, it's the first thing that we notice.
Yeah.
But somehow or other, I think our parents and grandparents, those who were alive during apartheid, have really failed their children by not having honest and frank discussions with them about race. But it has to go beyond the talking, Paul, because, you know, parents might talk to their children about race, but if the children, white children, never see black people in their home, apart from the helper or the gardener, they don't begin to see black people as professionals, somebody like you, as their doctor, as their teacher, then they're still going to be imbued with white privilege. So I think it's very important that parents and teachers too have a responsibility to really make children aware that, you know, all South Africans, whatever their race, have the potential to be more or less anything they want. And I think it also speaks to white privilege. I mean, that this white young man, Tienus, actually felt it was okay to actually piss on the belongings of a black fellow student. I mean, it says a lot about how we as white people, you know, feel that we can get away with all kinds of things that I'm sure black people wouldn't even consider, hopefully. So I think that we need to really look at the issue of white privilege and recognize it's not just about wealth, but it's really about how we see ourselves in this society.
What about classism?
Well, I think these things are all interconnected. Class, race, gender. I mean, if you look at GBV, for example, which also happens, it also happened in Stellenbosch. Somebody was arrested for rape. So I think these things are all interconnected. And that's why institutions and families and churches and any communities that get together really have a need to talk about these issues and make them commonplace so that people can understand it. And I think in the case of Stellenbosch and Paul, it's really a question of institutional culture.
Yeah.
I mean, how does a white student ever think that that behavior is okay? So to me it says something about the culture of the university, a culture where a white person feels that they can completely demean a young black person.
Is there relevance in the culture of the province? I mean, Johannesburg and Cape Town are very different.
I think that's such an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think so. I mean, I had a son who went to university in Cape Town, and that was one of the things, he's black, and that was one of the things that he noticed. It is, and we hear it often, Cape Town is another country.
Yeah.
And I think Stellenbosch is another university. I mean, it's a university with a very proud history, and one hopes that with the installation of Justice Edwin Cameron as their new chancellor, things will begin to be better. But there's always been that sense of privilege about the university. And, you know, as more black students began to go to WITS, for example, UCT, UJ, you saw white parents taking their children away from those universities and sending them to Stellenbosch, because that was considered to be a white university and a better university.
As you make reference to how these conversations need to happen, are we now referring to conversations around racial tolerance or racial acceptance?
You know, I think we have to go beyond tolerance, Paul. I think we need to be talking about anti-racism. I think we need to be teaching our children and each other in our organizations where we work together about the evils of racism and how racism is manifested, even through things like microaggressions. And if we're really going to build positive relationships with one another, we need to address this problem from an anti-racist perspective. You know, we're too quick in South Africa to think about reconciliation and rainbow nations and all these things that have proved to be so unhelpful. Even the term of social cohesion is just such a whitewashing of a very real problem. And the real problem is race. It's not social cohesion or, you know, reconciliation even. It's let's understand race. Let's understand that when I do such and such a thing, when I say such and such a thing, such words, the way they're received by a black person is going to let me know whether or not they're acceptable or whether I've been racist. And my intention is not the issue.
And it's a difficult admission, though, for someone to admit to it. Just because my mannerisms don't show you my discomfort, it may, that's why I speak about class, it may speak to different classes if I am accepting of the way that you're speaking to me because of my position. I might lose my job, or I might be discriminated.
You know, I think it's very much a two-way street. But I do think, you know, given the current situation, that we as white South Africans have a real responsibility. I mean, I understand there's something called internalized oppression, where black people have been subjugated and discriminated against for so many years that sometimes it's difficult for them to speak out. You know, you might get a young person going into a meeting, a young black person, degreed, articulate, but when he gets into that meeting and he's surrounded by white people, it might just be very difficult for him to speak out. So I think we have to be conscious and sensitive to internalized oppression. But I really think it's time that we as white people really began to understand the terrible damage that these kind of incidents are doing to our country. And they're devastating our hope for a better future, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. As you make reference to perhaps going back to the classroom and the role of the teacher who also might need to also relearn as she or he tries to convey this message to these young children, how much of an impact do you think our curriculum has when it comes to teaching about racism and looking at apartheid and its impact?
I think we've done very poorly. I mean, I really think our departments of education have done very poorly in this respect. And as you say exactly, our curriculum is not strong. Even in lessons where students are supposed to learn life orientation skills, there isn't nearly enough emphasis. And often the problem is that a white teacher may not have been trained, or may not know, or may not understand, or may willfully misunderstand the history of this country. And so she or he is not in a position to really help children to come to terms with it. So I think the way we train our teachers is extremely important. The way we obviously educate children, the curriculum that they have. And also, even if you look at universities and lecturers, I mean, to what extent do we prepare white lecturers for teaching in multiracial classrooms?
Yeah.
How much do they know about the lived experience of their black students? So I think just so much work needs to be done.
What about subject choices at perhaps higher learning institutions?
Well, I think that there's not enough education at school level to prepare people to really understand what their subject choices are going to mean for them. And, you know, I also think that perhaps, you know, students should have more opportunities to change subjects if they've chosen a particular subject which doesn't resonate with them once they get in there. And if you think about it, and if you think about the devastating levels of unemployment in South Africa, the huge levels of unemployment among black South Africans, how many parents are really adequately prepared to help their children make those kind of choices? I mean, the obvious things come to mind, you know, be a doctor, be a teacher, be a nurse. But, you know, the opportunities are so much different these days, and there are so many more opportunities. And I think part of the problem is that our children, and especially black children, are not, especially black children in rural areas who are living in informal settlements, who go to poor schools, the class issue again, are not prepared to be able to make an important decision like what should my subject choice be if I'm going on to tertiary.
Absolutely. What a fascinating conversation, an interesting perspective. Thank you so much for coming in studio to talk to us about this. Of course, speaking to Terry Oakley-Smith, founder of Diversi-T, Terry, speaking, of course, to this very burning issue of racism in learning institutions in South Africa.